Welcome back, guys. Today we are doing another character study, this time on Tulin of the Rito from Tears of the Kingdom. Joining me to talk about this kid is LinkedWolf, a Rito enthusiast with a growing YouTube channel. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, I'm LinkedWolf, and like Pixel said, I'm still relatively new to the whole YouTube scene. If you know anything about me already, it's probably that one of my favorite characters in The Legend of Zelda is Revali, and that love for the character led me to making an in-depth analysis on his character. Since then, I've released a few more videos on the Rito, with a handful more in the works. I'm really excited to be here to talk about easily the best sage in Tears of the Kingdom.
The video you did on Revali was really something. It shined a whole new light on the character I hadn't thought of before. While I do like the character, I've always basically just seen him as an anime archetype and little more. You made me think that there are good reasons for him to be the way he is, given that he had to build up his position all on his own, as to where the other champions were basically given their roles due to their family lines, especially now that we know of their relation to the ancient sages. While we will be talking about Revali and Teba in this video, the real focus of this episode is Tulin. What are your general thoughts on the young Rito warrior overall?
I absolutely love Tulin. Not only is his ability one of the most useful to Link during his journey, but he's just so cute! I mean, look at him! It's honestly impressive how much of a glow up he had between Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. He is so precious, I genuinely love him. But that aside, one of the biggest reasons I like Tulin as a character actually comes from a certain way you can view him, but I'm gonna save that for later in the video.
I do have to agree that he is pretty adorable, but also dedicated to his cause. I'm actually really impressed how all the Rito kids have grown up in the game and stepped up, though sadly we never see Tulin interact with the others. Let's go ahead and get into his backstory. Part 1. Tulin's backstory. As I'm sure everyone is aware at this point, Tulin appears in Breath of the Wild as a very young child. We don't know how old he was then, or really how quickly Rito aged overall. But if we look at the Rito kids around the village and compare them to Madison in Terrytown, we can get a sense for his age. It's been about 6 years since Breath of the Wild, most people say. Given his parents, what type of pressure do you think he is under growing up to live up to his father? Do you think he is generally expected to be a great warrior like his dad? Or given the freedom to grow into whatever he wants?
That's actually a question I'd never really thought about before. Obviously, we can't tell exactly, but I feel like there was some expectation for Tulin to become a warrior like his father. However, I don't necessarily think it was due to pressure put on him by Teba. From what little we saw in Breath of the Wild and that brief cameo in the DLC for Age of Calamity, I think he always wanted to become a warrior like his father. One of my favorite parts of the aftermath of Link and Teba freeing Fa Meadow in Breath of the Wild was probably seeing how excited Tulin got when Teba got back and took him out to the flight range to practice with his bow. I'll also bring up Age of Calamity because even though he's only seen in one cutscene, we get a sense to how much he wants to be a warrior like Teba and Revali. He's absolutely ecstatic when Revali compliments him, and he even goes as far as to imitate Revali when he says that he's going to surpass Teba one day. Also, I don't exactly know if this cutscene was foreshadowing his role as a sage, but not only does Tulin say that he wants to master the Great Eagle Bow, but he also displays his ability to control the wind with Tulin's Tornado, as he calls it.
The events of Age of Calamity are best taken with a grain of salt, I feel. It is a fractured timeline of possible behaviors, and, at worst, completely non-canon due to the past not being depicted properly as seen in Breath of the Wild. That being said, we can take Tulin's behavior to basically be canon as to how he would act. And yes, it is an adorable scene. I do find myself wondering, though, If the Age of Calamity developers had knowledge of Tulin's development in Tears of the Kingdom, and if they included this scene to foreshadow the child having the great power of wind in him, he is setting his sights high in the cutscene. And as we see in Tears of the Kingdom, he is convinced that he can do it all on his own. Given the proud nature of his father, we can see how he doesn't take failure lightly. All the same, do you feel that Tulin is trying too hard to live up to his father and even the great Revali? Remember that we can't be sure if this Tulin in Tears of the Kingdom is the one that appeared in the past and met the great champion.
That's definitely a fair point regarding Age of Calamity's canonicity. I'd love to go more into that, but it's definitely a discussion for another day. With Tulin, I feel like he was honestly acting like a normal kid who idolizes someone. I personally feel like Tulin is a pretty good representation of young children who want to try to help their parents with a task. It's something that we kind of see pretty often in both media and in real life. He definitely takes on that prideful and stubborn nature of his father, as we can first see when we meet him in Tears, though I'd argue his urge to go alone was more so because no one else really believed in the Stormwind arc. The adults were all too focused on gathering supplies and keeping the other children safe that none of them really had time to humor Tulin's idea of a fairy tale come to life. That's probably one of the reasons why he was so excited when Link showed up. He already knew how skilled the hero was from when Link helped free Ava Meadow with Teba, so if anybody would be able to help save the village, it would be Link.
It is true that the adults of the village see the story of the Stormwind arc as little more than a fairy tale. They are all focused on survival against the storm, as though they think that this is just an unusually powerful storm as a result of the upheaval. Still, with all the debris falling from the skies, you would think that they would at least consider the story a little bit. Plus, the storm center is clearly above Hebra. I can't help but to wonder what the previous elder Canali felt about the story. Regardless, it is clear that Tulin took the story at face value, and was convinced that the arc was there despite the actions of the rest of the village. As for him seeing Link, I'm guessing the Hylian champion really left an impression on him after that brief meeting back then. I'm not really sure if the Rito talk about Link and his involvement with Va Meadow. Such stories are word of mouth, unlike how his actions were immortalized in a statue over in Zora's domain. I'm a little torn if Tulin is engaging in just hero worship for Link, or is optimistic given Link's past dealing with the Calamity. Either way, he clearly hopes Link will be on board with his thoughts about the Stormwind arc. What are your thoughts, Wolf?
I definitely think it's a mix of both hero worship and optimism. In Breath of the Wild, the Rito were obviously all too familiar with the champions and what happened to them. They knew how exceptional they all were. Pretty much all of Hyrule did. I don't think it's too far-fetched to assume that many stories of Link's heroism from before the Calamity were passed down among Hylians and possibly shared with the Rito. During Breath of the Wild, none of the Rito actually believed that Link is the Hylian champion from 100 years ago, with Canelli only questioning if Link really is the Hylian champion if the Master Sword is in his possession. When Link talks to Teba and tells him the truth about who he is, Teba thinks he's joking. I can only assume that after Calamity Ganon was defeated and Princess Zelda returned, Teba and the rest of the Rito realized exactly who helped them save the village, and Tulin undoubtedly would have heard of that. As for the spreading of stories about Link instead of immortalizing him by building a monument, I'd just say that's how the Rito live. The only race to actually memorialize Link was, as you mentioned, the Zora, so maybe that's something unique to them due to their long lifespans. With the Rito specifically, they didn't really build anything to memorialize Revali when you think about it. Yes, he has Revali's Landing, but that was already there, as we can see in the Revali's Flat Memory. It was merely named after him.
All good points. To me, it seems like Sidon's statue of him and Link are more rooted in his admiration for Link. But that will be talked about more in the Zora video. I feel that we've discussed Tulin's backstory enough. His upbringing aside, what is clear, even in the Age of Calamity cutscene, is that he not only has the power of wind in him, but that he is exceptionally gifted and it is manifesting at an early age. Let's talk about that a bit more. But before that, have you been enjoying the video? If so, would you please consider liking and subscribing to the channel? I put a video out every week and work hard to make that happen. Hopefully, by the end of this video, I will have earned your subscription. Now, let's move on. Part 2. The Power of Wind. We now know, thanks to Tears of the Kingdom, that elemental power passes down to the children in the various races. Tulin has the power of wind in him, which accounts for his amazing aerial feats that we see in the game, and of course, his ability to generate powerful gusts of wind. One question I have for you though, do you think that Teba had this much power of wind in him as well? Clearly, Revali does, though his powers may have been enhanced by undergoing the Sheikah trials talked about in the Champion's Ballad. That is the thing that made him a champion after all, and those Meadow Ords hold power. Teba, however, seems to be just a skilled Rito warrior to me.
I was actually struggling to think of a way to explain why Teba seemingly lacks powers, though I do believe he does have them. Something I had completely missed in my playthrough was a line of dialogue that actually explains that all Rito have the power to control wind. In the case of Tulin, it's obviously stronger due to his direct connection to the ancient Sage of Wind. I certainly believe that Teba has the same powers of Tulin, though it's still up for debate on whether or not they're as strong as Tulin's. I think that if he does have them, he doesn't rely on them, as he seems to prefer using a bow. With Revali, I do have some thoughts on his powers, but those might be best saved for my video later.
You're right that all Rito have some power over the wind. The game implies that each race has varying degrees of power over their element. Sidon talks about how the Zora have control over water to different degrees, and writes on the stone tablet how he discovered his own abilities to manipulate water. More important though, is how he talks about the Zora keeping a good grip on their weapons because of it and so forth. Regarding the Rito, it could be very possible that their entire ability to fly is ultimately rooted in the power of wind. I think that Teba is probably better than most when it comes to this, shall we say, passive manipulation of the wind. It explains how he is able to get up to Vah Meadow so easily, carrying Link on his back no less. And while we should take Age of Calamity with a grain of salt, Teba seems more than capable of keeping up with Revali in aerial combat. There are other Rito we see too, such as Pin, who seems very capable of ascending straight up into the sky. What are your thoughts on that, Wolf?
Honestly, it's kind of annoying to me that there are some Rito who are just able to do that. The entire reason that Revali's Gale was such a big deal among the Rito was because it wasn't something everyone could do. It was a skill that was developed by Revali probably over a few months or even years of training. To see a normal Rito like Pen able to essentially just defy all logic and just ascend upwards creates somewhat of a continuity problem between Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom.
Continuity problems between Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom? You must be joking. I feel that the writers often forgot the things that they added with the Champion of the Ballad DLC. For example, the huge elevator shaft and dungeon under the Shrine of Resurrection, though they did at least remember the picture at the end of the DLC, and Link does hum the Champion's Ballad song when cooking on occasion. Anyhow, we are stuck in a situation where we have to take what they put forth as fact, despite how much it might cause a contradiction, which leads to speculation. We can see that Pen is able to ascend straight up without the flashy effects of Revali kicking up his gale, or even the Tulin tornado, and yet we know very little about Pen. It could be that he is more skilled than we think. I mean, he is flying all over Hyrule, so perhaps his control of the wind is greater than it seems. I do agree that he doesn't seem like anything all that special, and his flight could be as superficial as the developers of the Lucky Gazelle question chain, taking a all Rito can fly at face value.
Yeah, that's pretty much the excuse I've chalked it up to. The line of dialogue explaining that the Rito can't ascend vertically isn't really said anywhere in the main quest from what I can remember. If I'm correct, you can only get that dialogue after visiting Teba and Tulin at the flight range once Ba Meadow is defeated. Though it could also be from the Champion's Ballad. I don't fully remember. I can definitely forgive that since it's a fairly minor contradiction in the grand scheme of things, but it still doesn't make it any less annoying to deal with.
I get that. I really do. I think we've covered the power of wind plenty, though the Stormwind arc leaves some questions about it hanging. But to talk about that, we should really move on to the next topic. Part 3. The Zonai and the Rito. Another thing that doesn't transfer well between the games is the whole concept of the Zonai hiding their islands in the sky, and that the Rito are apparently unable to reach them. Considering how high Ba Meadow was in the sky, you would think that being that high would allow them to see the sky islands and ruins up there, which of course would include the Stormwind arc itself. What are your feelings about the Zonai being a sky race? And yet, apparently the Rito had little contact or knowledge of them outside of an old fairy tale.
Honestly, I personally always assumed the Sky Islands being basically invisible could just be attributed to the cloud barrier from Skyward Sword. Admittedly though, I'm not entirely sure if it functions like a ceiling where things can't fly through unless there's an opening, or if it just covers things in the clouds. I know I've heard talks about the cloud barrier explaining how the islands were hidden before, and right now, I think that might be one of the best answers we've got. As for the limited knowledge about the Zonai, I feel like that's fairly excusable. We don't really know how much time has passed between the events of the Imprisoning War and the events of the Upheaval, but we do know that it's been long enough for basically everything about the Zonai to fade into myth, similar to how all the other games in the series seem to be nothing more than legends in the era of the Wild. After a while, stories from the time of the Imprisoning War became just that, stories.
I've thrown a lot of criticism at the idea of the cloud barrier on my channel, especially given how it functions in Skyward Sword as opposed to what we see in Tears of the Kingdom. For example, at the start of the game before it is supposedly dispelled by the dragon, we can see the ground in far-off mountains in the distance. I even have some footage of seeing the Hebra region from around the Temple of Time, before the Master Sword is sent away. My point being, it's not certain that the cloud barrier from Skyward Sword exists in this continuity, if it is even the same continuity as the main games. And if it is, the Zonai technology used to hide their sky islands could very well be different from what Goddess Hylia used back then. I'll avoid that tangent though and move back to fairy tales fading into myth, because you are onto something there. We see around Hyrule a few people who are skeptical about the recent calamity, and with the extensive cleanup of the Sheikah technology, it seems that the youth of the kingdom are questioning if the tragedy really happened at all. This is basically just one generation into peace as well, so it could be that stories and legends just don't keep well in Hyrule. The reluctance of the Rito to consider the Stormwind arc story that Tulin is going on about seems like a perfect example of this phenomenon. You would think though, that given the upheaval, an old legend about the Zonai falling from the heavens and being held back into the sky, beyond whatever cloud barrier exists, would be something that they would consider now that there are literal sky islands visible across the land.
I do think it's a little bit weird that all of the Rito seem to just excuse the old stories about the Stormwind arc when there are floating islands appearing all over the sky. Though at the same time, I think it's kind of a reasonable response. I mentioned before that most Rito were probably more focused on survival than the possibility of some fairy tale being real. After all, my first thought during a terrible blizzard that's making it hard for everyone to survive wouldn't be, oh hey, there's an old fairy tale about a bunch of boats in the sky. It would be on making sure there's enough food so that no one starves. With the Sky Islands, I suppose it could be safe to assume that the Rito might not have seen them. While the storm does seem a bit tame around the village, it was probably a lot worse earlier, since we see that the bridge is out. I can imagine that at that time, visibility was awful. Though admittedly, I never really looked up when I was in Rito Village during that part of the story, so I can't really say for certain if you could see the nearby archipelagos.
I can tell you that when you look up, you can basically see everything in the sky except for what is hidden in the heart of the storm above Hebra. It makes it a bit hard to handwave what is going on. But, to be fair, the most critical part of the Stormwind arc story, a massive ship in the sky, simply isn't visible. So there is that. I really want to believe that there is more of a connection to the Rito and the Zonai on account of them both being sky people. And yet, the game offers no real evidence to support that. I wonder if the resident bard, you know, that guy who was spouting off old legends in Breath of the Wild, would have any details on the connections of the Rito and the Zonai. What are your thoughts on Cass not appearing in this game?
I have a number of thoughts about Cass not appearing. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me that his daughters are in the game, but he's nowhere to be seen. There's also the fact that he's sort of become a fan favorite character, so I know that a lot of people, myself included, were really hoping to see him return in Tears of the Kingdom. If I had to make a guess as to where he's gone, I think he's gone to a land outside of Hyrule in search of new songs to bring back home. We know that lands outside of Hyrule still exist at this point in time thanks to Yona's character profile stating that she comes from, quote, another domain. I would have hoped that he would make a return in the DLC, but it now looks like we probably won't be getting any.
A lot of people, including myself, are hoping for just that, though the recent announcement has been a bit of a downer. I was really hoping to see something like the Runes of Skyloft, or maybe some of the land outside of Hyrule given that Yona comes from a different domain. It would make sense that the Rito are also beyond the borders of the kingdom. Let's go ahead and shift the focus back to Tulin and his growth before we wrap up. Part 4. Tulin's Growth. We've already talked about his story arc, but there is something that sort of bugs me about it. Not just about Tulin, but all the sages. Basically, they get their secret stones that are supposed to amplify their power, but none of them really seem all that more powerful with it. Do you feel that Tulin is stronger now that he is a sage? Or that he is basically the same as he was when he was fighting alongside you during the Rito story?
Physically, I don't think any of the sages get stronger while in the possession of a secret stone. The game never really gives us a before and after comparison. They do, however, seem to become stronger in the sense that they can create near-perfect clones of themselves to help Link throughout his journey. I don't know if these are like projections of themselves that they need to focus on to maintain, or if they're just perfect clones created from the bond the sages share from Link. If it's the first option, then I do believe that the secret stones do strengthen their ability so that Link is able to access them whenever he needs them. If it's the second option, then I'd have to say no.
I suppose that could be the case if the stones were empowering them. But then they immediately transfer that excess power to Link for him to use with their avatar. So, I guess that makes sense. I don't know. I feel like outside of what we see with Ganondorf doing, and Zelda traveling over 10,000 years into the past, the secret stones are a bit underwhelming. It's probably more about the person who has the power than the power itself. And so, the question will be, how does Tulin choose to use the power now that he has it? What type of growth do you see in him over the course of the game? And what type of growth do you think being the sage would have on him as he matures?
To fully explain the growth that I see in Tulin, I do have to point some things out about Revali and Teba, which may sound a little weird at first, but hear me out, okay? Around the time of the final trailer's release, I was talking with some friends on Discord in Sean Chiplock's Discord server. For those of you who don't know, he's the voice actor of both Revali and Teba. We were all talking about how we didn't see Teba in the trailer, and Sean actually pointed out an interesting way to view Tulin, basically saying that Revali, Teba, and Tulin could be seen as one big character arc. Revali was cocky and overconfident in his abilities at times. That, in combination with the fact that he could barely see during his fight, ultimately led to his death. Teba, meanwhile, is nowhere near as arrogant as Revali was, but he was overconfident. That overconfidence ultimately led to his friend Hearth getting injured when they tried to stop Valmetto alone, and it could have costed him his life had Link not stepped in to help. And although he was still injured, it was nowhere near as bad as it could have been. Tulin, then, is the "I've learned from my mistakes and will avoid their fates," While he does show some of his father's arrogance, he's clearly more receptive towards Link helping him.
I am unfamiliar with Mr. Chiplock's server, but it's cool to hear that you were able to talk with him and his work as a voice actor. Overall though, Tulin's perception towards Link helping out could simply be rooted in him finally having a person who is willing to listen to him about the Stormwind arc story, especially since it feels like he's kinda being grounded by his dad. I see Tulin's story as one of adolescence kicking in. Tulin expressing his beliefs and not willing to just do what the adults are telling him to do. In a way, there is some arrogance on his end, I think, even if his heart is in the right place. He wants to get to the root of the problem and not just try to weather the storm. Given Link's reputation, Tulin could see this as an opportunity to explore the fairy tale more in order to challenge his father's orders.
That's a completely reasonable way to view Tulin's story, and I can definitely see how he can be viewed that way. We don't know how old Tulin is, but he does seem to be around the age where he'd start rebelling, for lack of a better word. He's not fully there yet, obviously, but we don't know how fast the Rito reach maturity, and we probably never will. I will agree with you on the point that Tulin probably saw Link as a way to explore the story of the Stormwind arc, since I feel like compared to a lot of the things that this incarnation of Link has done and seen, he'd probably believe a story about some flying boats.
Of course, we see little more of Tulin beyond the base story here. He and the others show up to help Link at Hyrule Castle, and then again in the depths. I feel like his line when he shows up to help against the Demon King's army really shines some light on his growth, don't you? Even if it is kind of a stock anime phrase.
When we fight together, we're unstoppable!
It's definitely a good message that does reflect how much he's grown, but like you said, it's really weighed down by the fact that we see the moral of, when we work as a team, we can do anything! Pretty much everywhere you look, not just in anime. Overall though, I think it kinda works with Tears of the Kingdom as somewhat of an opposite towards the feelings of loneliness and loss portrayed in Breath of the Wild story. All things considered, they could have done a lot worse.
I think that Tulin's shift late game is a reflection of those values seeping into him, changing him for the better. Plus, after the blizzard, Teba is more willing to work and listen to him in order to dig up information about the Fifth Sage, even if it is off camera. I really wish we could have had a bigger part in that. I think that we've covered things pretty good here. Any final thoughts before we wrap up the video?
Nah, I think I've said everything that's on my mind.
Alright then. Thanks for coming to the channel to share your feelings on Tulin. I'll of course link all of your information in the description, and that incredible Revali video you did months ago. Make sure to stay tuned for the second part of this collaboration going up on his channel. Any final statements you have for the viewers, Wolf?
Hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, and remember that the Akka from Twilight Princess have human teeth. You're welcome for those free nightmares.
Yes, they certainly do. Thanks for making it to the end of the video. I'd like to give LinkedWolf another thank you for joining me today. Make sure to check out his channel and that amazing video on Revali he did. If you haven't done so already, a like and subscribe to the channel would go a long ways. If you're able to help out more, come on over to my Patreon or become a channel member. In addition to getting a shout out on my next video, you'll gain access to my Discord where we can talk more directly. I'm always happy to talk about Zelda stuff, and it's the best way to give me input on what's coming in the future. Oh, and you'll get your name down below, just like these people. Thank you. Thank you everybody who supports me. That's it for today. Be safe, and may the way of the hero lead to the Triforce.